It's really great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to be speaking close to home. I live in Washington, D.C., also in Northern California, so anytime I get a chance to speak, either here or there, I'm delighted. As was mentioned, I've had a few jobs in my career. A few interesting jobs. One of these was a real Mickey Mouse organization. You can probably guess which one. This was the first day on the job at the White House. So what they do is you show up in the morning, you go to an orientation, they show you where the bathroom is, where your office is. And on this particular day, one of my team said to me, by the way, you have a meeting with the president right after lunch. I said, really? What are we talking about? They said, don't worry, just show up. Your team has done a wonderful job. So you can see the look on my face there. This is the look of, what the hell am I doing here? Is this really the Oval Office? Is this President Obama and the Vice President that I'm sitting here with? I'm in total shock. We were actually showing President Obama a website that we'd developed, that the team had developed, showing how many people were visiting federal websites right at that moment, and he was quite interested in the technology. This was my view from the window of my office. Looked out over the front of the White House, and I got to see all the comings and goings when any dignitaries were showing up, so that was kind of fun. Got to do a few fun things, like go to Camp David and a few other fun things. But this was a bad day at work. Testifying in front of Congress. Shortly after I arrived, we discovered that we had suffered a breach at the Office of Personnel Management. 21 million records had been compromised. And naturally, we had to go talk to Congress about what had happened and why it happened and what we were doing about it. You notice that same stunned look on my face? I'm thinking exactly the same thing. Why am I here? I can't believe I'm sitting here and that these Congress people are grilling us on all these questions. It's not fun. If any of you have ever had the chance to testify in front of Congress in an adverse situation, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And this was the last day at work. When a president leaves, so does most of the senior staff. Anybody who's been a political appointee, and a whole new team takes over. It's a weird way we run our government, but virtually the entire leadership changes every 4 to 8 years. And since leaving the White House, I've been working on some of the long-term systemic issues that come from, or what happens to IT when you have change of direction like that every few years. It's not necessarily a good thing. Okay, so I want to talk to you about technology and governance and risk and compliance today. And what I'm going to talk about is where I see some of the challenges coming in the future. You all know about the Internet of Things, the role that big data is playing in our environment. I call it Moneyball everywhere. Those of you that have read the books or have seen the movie, really understand what the role of big data is in our corporate environments today. And every business, I think, is a Moneyball business. It's big data analytics, sucking in data from all kinds of different places, and we're using that to make important decisions about how we run our businesses and the important questions that we should be answering. And it's not just for CIOs or chief marketing officers. I was intrigued by this conference that was being put on for lawyers. I actually am a lawyer as well, at Stanford Law School. And the topic was, big data and privacy. And these are some of the challenges that are coming about because of these interesting changes in technology. So I think there's three really big transformation drivers that we're going to have to pay attention to in the next 5 years or so. The first one is just this relentless digitization that I see taking place in every aspect of business, whether it's marketing or operations, legal, finance, HR. There's this relentless digitization going on across the landscape. All of this is also being impacted by new security challenges and privacy regulation and privacy issues. And then the last thing is the increasingly important role of machine learning and AI. And I want to touch on each of these individually. So let's talk about relentless digitization for a second. What this really is the upending of a traditional analog business model. So if you think if you're in a company that's been around for any length of time, you can probably, in your mind, have a picture of the org chart of your company. So put that mental image in your head for a second. And probably it's a very typical hierarchical organization structure, organized by function, and it probably worked reasonably well for a really long time. But if you take the systems architecture of that typical organization, or maybe your organization, and lay it against the organizational model, you'll often see a one-to-one match. That is, the systems serve the organizational structure, and that was a great analog model and worked historically really well. It's how decisions got made. That model is how funding got done. It's how governance took place. Everything followed that traditional analog business model. But the reality is, digital business today is this complex, intersected web of information and technology and flow of data. And any of you who look at a modern business architecture, particularly a business that's highly successful, will see the picture that I've put up here in terms of the reality. Now, this looks like a spider web to some people, and it is in many cases, because it's a bunch of interfaces and other customized data flows. But the reality is we leverage data from across the ecosystem that we participate in. And there's no successful business that I know of that doesn't do this in spades today. The reality is it's a software-defined everything today. Just like it's Moneyball everywhere, the future is software-defined in many, many respects. And I apologize for bringing back Clippy, an old Microsoft friend, but I think it's a sign of the times. Maybe Microsoft was just a little ahead of its time with Clippy. Now let's talk about security and privacy for a second. For most of us, the unfortunate reality is we have to retrofit security and privacy on top of an established stack of structure in terms of systems and architecture and business practices and so on. That's our reality. But I want to make the case for, as we have the opportunity, to build security and privacy in from the beginning as part of the design of the architecture and of the systems that we put in place. And by analogy, I want you to play a little game with me. Having worked at General Motors, I'm a car nut, or maybe I got to General Motors because I'm a car nut. But I want you to play this mind game with me. On the left is a 1966 Mustang convertible, a classic car, a design icon from the 60s. On the right is a 2018 Mustang. Now, if you drive the 2018 Mustang, you'll find that it comes standard with anti-lock brakes, a fuel-efficient engine that's software-driven. It has airbags, it has all kinds of ride control features that are, again, driven by software. It has a media and entertainment system that has 100 million lines of code in it to make the nav system work and so on. It's a pretty cool car. And it follows some of the same design cues that the one on the left does. Now, if you weren't to drive the 66 Mustang as it came out of the factory, it would be a pretty disappointing experience compared to driving the one on the right. But what if we said, we're going to take all the stuff that's in the 2018 and retrofit it into the 66 Mustang? We're going to get our duct tape and our baling wire and, screws and what have you, and we're going to take all that technology out of the 18 and put it in the 1966 car. First of all, I would tell you it'd be very expensive. And second, hard to do. And third, I'm not sure what the 66 Mustang would look like when you're all done, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be very pretty. But in essence, that's what we're asking you to do and our systems and IT people to do when we say, let's take all the modern rules and regulations and everything else and challenges from a cybersecurity and privacy perspective and retrofit it onto legacy technology. It's hard to do, it's expensive, and sometimes it's not pretty. So I'm an advocate for secure by design and making sure that through our architectural processes and our governance processes and so on, that we ask the right questions up front as we're putting systems together or modifying things as the case may be. A concept that's getting wide adoption in the cybersecurity space is zero trust computing. Now again, I want you to play a little bit of a mind game with me. When we think about technology, particularly things that have been developed over the last, say, 10 or 15 years, what you realize is we've optimized for interoperability. We've made sure that anything that we make should be able to connect to and communicate with almost any other piece of technology. Think of Bluetooth or the USB standards are consumer examples, but these exist across technology broadly. Through great standards, we've been able to build large, complex systems because the engineering designs are so good and so pervasively adopted that everything works with almost everything else today. And that's great. It's allowed us to scale. It's allowed us to do wonderful things with technology. But what we haven't done is ask the next question, which is, should we interoperate? Should we connect? Should these things work together? can we trust that the thing we're connecting to is appropriately configured, is secure, is safe, is free from malware and so on? And the answer in many cases today is we don't do that, or we don't know how to do that, or we don't have the technology in place to make sure that can happen. And so zero trust computing is all about the assumption that whatever I'm connecting to may not be safe. And trust can be gained over time, not instantaneously. Now, there's a lot of talk about quantum computing. Everybody keeps saying it's a few years away. I've been hearing that for about the last 10 years, that it's 5 years away. So I'm still not sure when it's going to be here at scale and be in common use. D-Wave just announced the next generation of their quantum computing is coming out in 2020, so I'm looking forward to that. But there are folks who are already thinking about post-quantum. What happens after quantum computers are in general use? And one of the concerns are that quantum computers, when broadly adopted, will be able to break a lot of the current encryption algorithms, and that we won't even know it until it's too late. So there's a lot of work going on to develop quantum-proof cryptography technologies. Again, I think this is an important development, but the thing that I would ask you to think about is, in your organizations, how forward-looking do you need to be, or should you be, in terms of securing the data and the information that your organization possesses? This is an area that I think you're going to want to pay attention to. And of course, there's a lot of talk now about GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act that all have some common basis in terms of what's required for compliance. I'm affiliated with the law firm Squire Patton Boggs, and a lot of the work we do now is in this privacy and cybersecurity space, because it's become such a critical issue for most companies. There's a new California law that was passed, I think, last year that's really interesting. It applies to all connected devices sold in California. So California being a large market, it means it's sort of the de facto standard. But it's embracing some of these secure by design principles that I talked about earlier. No more default passwords, but it also requires the manufacturer of the device to anticipate how it might be used by a typical consumer and make sure that the device has appropriate security built into it from the beginning. And that's a new standard that I hope gets more widely adopted. Lastly, I want to talk about AI and machine learning, because I think this is really on everybody's mind these days. Again, the predictions around AI are similar to the quantum predictions in terms of when are we going to have a computer that's as smart as a human, or a bunch of other things like that. And I love Jeff Livingston's observation here that the technology is moving faster than our readiness as humans to be prepared for it. So a sub-area of AI is something called robotic process automation. In most cases, it doesn't actually involve robots, but it involves software that does human tasks, take over mundane work that humans have historically been, or at least for the last 40 years or so been doing. And I love this Dilbert cartoon that kind of, I think, in some ways represents how we all might think about this. But the reality is it's going to make a bunch of jobs go away. It's, in theory, a lot of white-collar jobs, things like insurance processing and so on, where decisions have to be made, where data is looked at and then acted on by a human today, in many cases will be taken over by software. And software that we don't really understand what it's doing. Truck driving could go away if self-driving vehicles become a reality. And I think this will actually happen in the next few years. But for just a moment, I want you to think about the speed at which this is advancing. And I did a little comparison of the human brain versus today's technology. This is 2019 technology. It's widely assumed that the human brain has about 2.5 petabytes of memory. That's a huge amount of memory. And we have one of the most complex computers that's ever been created in our heads. But 2019 technology is virtually unlimited. There's no barrier to things beyond 2.5 petabytes. We're creating this much information in some organizations every single day. The brain processes thoughts or can do things, it's been measured around 13 milliseconds, but the computer does it in less than 10. And if you have multiple computers, they can do this simultaneously. The fastest human can react to stimulus. This is seeing something or in response to hearing something in about 166 milliseconds. Really, really good athletes can cut this in about half, but the average is about 166 milliseconds. A computer, on the other hand, is 10 milliseconds, a fraction of that. So if you have a world that has lots of sensors all over the place, and you can tell what's going on every 10 milliseconds with unlimited processing power, it gives you a sense of the possibilities. The brain has about 100 billion neurons. Today's modern graphics processing chips that are largely what GPUs that we use in artificial intelligence have 4 billion transistors. And that number doubles every 18 months to 2 or 3 years. Our network speed as humans is really slow. We rely on human communication, on speech and on hearing, and making one-to-one or one-to-many contacts. But it takes us a long time to make connections. And typical computer can have billions of connections. And the most scary part, our human brain evolves over decades and maybe centuries. Computers evolve very quickly. 2x every 3 to 5 years. We get double the power for the speed. So I ask you, who's going to win in this race? This is where we're at today. I think you can guess, as I do, that the issues of how we as humans interact with the computer systems around us, and AI in particular that's being driven by these trends, is going to be on us very, very quickly if it isn't already in your organization. I want to end with a story about Stanislov Petrov. How many of you know who Stanislov Petrov is? Anybody here? Okay, good. So in the Reagan era, in about 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislov Petrov was at work one day, and his job was running the missile defense system for the Soviet Union. He came into work, and they'd installed a relatively new system of sensors that were designed to detect incoming ballistic missiles, nuclear missiles, if you will. And his job and his team's job was to defend the Soviet Union in the event of a nuclear attack by an enemy. And he's at work one morning, he had his first cup of coffee, and all of a sudden the alarms went off. And it looked like the US had launched a nuclear missile attack on the Soviet Union. And at the time, Stanislav Petrov had about 10 minutes to decide whether to arm the defensive systems and fire back at the US. And Stanislav Petrov didn't take 10 minutes. After about 2 or 3 minutes, he decided this must be a false alarm. Everybody calm down, stand down, don't retaliate. Now, had he made the other decision, it would have launched probably a global thermonuclear war. When asked how did he decide, he said a couple of things. The first thing was, I don't trust the computer. It's a new system, and I don't have any track record of how it performs. Second thing he said was, if the US was going to launch an attack on the Soviet Union, they would have fired more than the 7 missiles that their system detected were coming at them. His logic was, if the US was going to attack us, they'd come at us full force, and there would be hundreds of missiles, not 7. Thirdly, he reasoned there was no reason for the US to attack. There'd been no tensions at that particular point that had suddenly risen or issues that had come up that would have predicated a US attack. And so he told everybody, stand down. Stanislav Petrov died about 2 years ago. Eventually became a general in the Russian army and was interviewed extensively on this. And unfortunately was not given the sort of hero's recognition that I think he probably deserves. But his example, I think, stands for something that we should all be thinking about when we're thinking about artificial intelligence and automation and so on, which is, how do we create these systems in a way that serve humans well, that protect us against runaway software, false alarms, those kinds of things. We see examples today in the Boeing 737 MAX issues with faulty sensors and software that probably wasn't designed as well as it could have been. And I think it's our role as technologists and as people who are involved in governance and compliance and risk management to fully measure the risks that come with this growing body of capability that we have in our software and technology. And so I think there's some big questions that we should be asking ourselves. How do we govern this? What's the government role in all of this? Should there be built-in circuit breakers? How frequently should we inspect or validate what software is doing in our environments, the decisions that it's making in place of humans? And how do we balance human considerations, things like employment, versus machines' capability to do those same jobs. And how do we build accountability and transparency into the AI implementations that inevitably we're going to rely on in our organizations? And these are just a few of the discussions that I hope we get to have as we go forward. Thank you. I appreciate your attention and look forward to speaking with you later. Thanks.